Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Melanin Margin. I'm your host, Quaviondre Williams.
And I'm Daquon Wilson.
And this is the talk show dedicated to bringing the marginalized to the spotlight and uplift the Black voices that will no longer stay silent. So let's get into this week's race conversation.
We're all aware that the American media has an immense effect on the perception of races in other societies. So, Quaviondre, I wanted to ask you, do you think that it is the responsibility of show creators and production companies to ensure that the stories they create don't fall into those stereotypes?
Absolutely. I 100%. I think specifically there was this conversation I saw a while back about Q-Force. I don't know if you heard of it on Netflix. And like a lot of the times I would see there was a lot of stereotypes in that show. And one of the biggest problems that people had with it, wasn't the fact that it was gay people on the show. It was the stereotypes that they use within the gay community, like the twink who only does drag and who doesn't have anything, is not really as smart as other people, or the goth kid who doesn't really, who's the goth emo person who is the hacker and stuff like that. The black girl, the black lesbian lady who's twice the size of the men and stuff like that. And so it was very much so, relying on some heavy stereotypes in the show. And I think there's something to be said about creators. Even if you are a part of that community, you can still reinforce negativity. You can still reinforce negative stereotypes. Does that make sense? I think that we oftentimes, because a lot of times the conversation was like, well, it shouldn't get that much hate because blah, 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 blah. And it's kind of like, well, no, I think it's not about hating. I think it's about recognizing the fact that even if you are a part of a community, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, all that stuff is embedded within our society. It's in the fabric of our, communities and stuff like that. And even if we are aware that it's a problem, it still is sometimes so subconscious that we don't even realize we're creating those stories that reflect such negative stereotypes. Like for me personally, when I, as a writer, my biggest thing as a writer was to be a lot more inclusive in my storytelling, right? That was my biggest thing. I was like, I wanted to be the change that I wanted to see in television. So I wanted to create stories, not just for Black people, but also having Asian leads in my story, and, all kind of different races and creeds and, disabilities and stuff like that and all that good stuff. And I realized I was getting the premise for a story that I was going to write, right? It was this episode about an Italian character. And the first thing that came to my mind was like, ooh, he's going to be a gay person who's going to be in the mob, and his family was a mob, and whatever. And I just went and I was building the whole story about it, right? And then something just told me, it was like, Google Italian stereotypes. And I was like, well, okay, let me try that. So I went to go and Google. I was like, am I being stereotypical here? And it was like several articles that said the problematic undertones of writing Italian stories centering around mob culture and the mafia. And I just was like, oh my goodness, like I didn't even realize, as an African American, as someone who is oppressed in our society, I didn't even realize that I held some of those stereotypes and prejudices in my head. And it might not be something I might say, oh, I don't like Italian people, nothing like that. A prejudice isn't necessarily as outward thing. It can sometimes be just simply thinking, believing stereotypes or believing some things about a story. You know what I mean? So like,
Yeah.
I didn't even recognize that I had that in me. And so, of course, I reevaluated and I was like, okay, just like then I had to take myself out of, the shoes of somebody like, oh, I just want to create diversity. I was like, okay, create a story and make the character Italian. Create a good story and make the character Asian. Create a good story and make them this or that and the fourth. Stop thinking about the stereotypes, because once again, your first mind is society. The first thought you have is society, and it's the homophobia, transphobia, racism, all that stuff embedded in there. But your second thought and your first action is your fault. That's your responsibility. So before I put pen to paper, before I put my finger to the keyboard, I was like, hold on, let me do my research, because I'm not a part of that community. And let me see if I'm reinforcing those stereotypes or reinforcing something that I'm not even aware might be something that's a problematic element. And because I did that research, I was able to recognize, oh, wait a minute, I held some of that in me. I held those negative stereotypes without even knowing it, not consciously aware of it. Because of course I'm not out here going, oh, I don't like, being, rude or prejudiced towards Italian people, but
Right.
reinforcing that negative ideal is a problem. And it was something that I was able to go out and realize, oh, wait, I'm recognizing that's a problem.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. I think that absolutely, as somebody who's writing a show or producing a show, directing, whatever you are doing, it is your responsibility to make sure that you are not painting these characters as just stereotypes. It is
Mm-hmm.
1000% your responsibility to create shows and create experiences for people that are not just solely relying on stereotypes. Because if I'm being honest, that's just weak writing. Like, like when I was a creative writing major, one of the biggest things that I learned was that the best writing and my best writing came when it was like unexpected. Like
Yeah.
I live in New York City now. So if I was like describing the city, I could easily say something like the Big Apple or the concrete jungle or
Yeah.
the city that never sleeps. But those are all super predictable. But if I said
Exactly.
something like, I don't know, the land where dreams come to die under starless skies or blossom amidst subway cries, that's such a different and more nuanced description of New York City because A, it's
Mm.
broader. Like you can't immediately be like, oh, that's New York City. But then you think about it and it's like, maybe they're referencing gentrification, how some people come
Mm-hmm.
in here and flourish despite the infrastructure of the city being, crying out because of that. Or maybe it's like, oh, so many people come here with these big dreams and then become pawns to capitalism. And like that is so much more than just like the stereotypical depiction of New York City. And I think that's why it's so important as a writer, as a creative, to go outside of the box and not rely on stereotypes because you get something that's so much more rich and entertaining.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. I think that there is something to be said about it. It is lazy. It's lazy to just go about what is already quote unquote known about a certain community. It's lazy to go about, well, Asian people, Asian, martial arts. There we go. Or Asia or Native American people going straight to reservations and that kind of stuff. And it's just like there's just so much more nuance that I think is not really put towards creative fields that we're seeing, especially in um the more mainstream ones. And I wanted to ask you, like, do you think, speaking about stereotypes, do you think that all stereotypes about marginalized people are bad no matter what, or can those stereotypes be accidental? Like, do you think this should be eradicated in film and television altogether? Like, do they serve a purpose? Like, I guess that's what I'm asking.
Right. I'm going to take the hard stance, cut all the stereotypes out because there is no way a stereotype cannot be negative or have some
Yeah.
type of negativity connected to it. Because even things we would think about as like positive, like, oh, Asians are good at math. But like, if you really think about what that stereotype is saying, it's Asians are only good for productivity. Asians are only
Mm.
good when they're showing some type of intelligence. If you think
Mm-hmm.
about, oh, black people are good at basketball, like sure, being having a skill is great, but that's just saying black people are only worth it when they're entertaining us. Or like I
Exactly.
remember seeing on TikTok somebody was talking about like, oh, like I was getting my house built and like as soon as they started speaking Spanish, I knew it was going to get done. And it's like then you're only saying that Latino people are only worth it when they're putting in hard work, and that just allows you to exploit them even more. So no
Wow.
positive stereotype is good or worth it in our society. So we need to make sure our media are not perpetuating any stereotypes at all, regardless of whether you see them as positive, because they're not.
Yeah, I think that there is definitely, I think it's all about nuance. I don't think it's all about nuance because let's not, we all are aware that there are some Asian people that are good at math. We all know there are some Asian people who are good at martial arts. We know there are some Black people who are good at basketball and stuff like that or whatever. We know that, some of these stereotypes are based in some very small aspect of a reality. But I do think that there is something to be said about how you choose to represent that. So it's not so much if you're creating the first thought when you create a story about a Black person shouldn't be about them playing basketball. But if in your movie your character is does like basketball and it just happens to be black, and I think that's where the problem comes, is that like a lot of these movies that we see, you know, when we see white people who like math, or white, like Good Will Hunting comes to mind, or stuff like that, like, you know, it's not some big, oh my goodness, you know, oh, you know, they're white and they like math, you know, it's not like this, you know, or like it's not a big to do. And I think that's the problem that we have, is that while, you know, it is something like, you know, like I said, having a story where an Asian person may have a martial arts skill is not a problem. It's the fact that that's the only story you're telling. And again, right, the story that you're telling is oftentimes not written by an Asian person. And so it starts to create this negative idea. And like, I fully agree with what you mean. Like, as far as, are there good stereotypes? No. And in the eradication of them, I think it's a little difficult to eradicate stereotypes as a whole, because unfortunately, once again, they are based in some truth, not completely, but they are based in some truth or in some aspects of it. So like, while again, you know, there is like I said, there are several African Americans who who are good at basketball. We're not monoliths. You know what I mean? So just because some of us are good at it doesn't mean that all of us are good at it. Just because, you know, just because this Asian person might be into math doesn't mean that all Asian people are into math. You know, and I think that the problem is when they start to base the story around the stereotype and reinforcing, like, he's black, you know, he's going to be great at basketball, or he's Asian, you know, he's going to automatically know kung fu, or he's, you know, Native American, you know, he's going to obviously know how to do the reservations in the healing thing, or whatever the case may be. So I think that it's just that understanding about the fact that in these situations and in these storytellings, I think that it's incumbent upon us, especially as, you know, people within the community creating stories about our communities, to not rely so heavily on stereotypes that will oftentimes have a negative impact, because we know what happens when people think that all Black women are aggressive. We know what happens when all people think all gay people are sexually promiscuous, you know, and it's like, you know, while it is a person of color or a LGBTQA person making the story about whatever they're making it about, it can still be damaging. And I think that recognizing that damage and understanding, okay, do I have to make the gay character promiscuous? Do I have to make the bi character greedy, quote unquote, you know, like people want to call them out in media or whatever, or stuff like that. So, I mean, it doesn't make sense, Daquon. Am I making sense here?
Yeah, you totally make sense. And you said something interesting that I want to talk about, of just like this idea of like there's some type of truth in stereotypes. And I also want to propose, like, there's a lot of times when those truths then come from the stereotypes. So thinking about something like, you know, there are a lot of Black basketball players who play well. Yeah. But if you think about where the stereotype of Black people being good at basketball comes from, it's a longer history of just like Black people being seen as being able to work more and being built to, you know, do all of these different things. Or even just like Asians are good at math. Like, you know, that stereotypes come from so many people not wanting Asian people to come to this country unless they were bringing something. So they had to be these great mathematicians and professors and stuff like that just to be here in this country. So I think that there's this like interesting duality, or just like, of like life imitating art and then art imitating life, and just like vice versa, with stereotypes imitating life and then life imitating those stereotypes.
I'm so glad you said that, because as soon as you said that's the first thing I thought about was art imitates life. I think that's where it comes in again, where it's like we just talked about, like why it's easy to write about Asian person being good at math, or it's easy to write about a Black person being good at basketball, or Asian person being a martial artist. But the reality is, unfortunately, like you said before, because that's what we are seeing, it oftentimes reinforces the idea that that's all we can do. And so when you're a Black kid watching television and all you're seeing is movies about us playing basketball or us being a sports or athletic, that automatically makes you think, well, that's the only thing I can offer as a African American. And like you said, as Asian people, they feel like that's all they can. So I see what you're saying. It's like the idea of like the snake eating its own tail kind of thing, where it's like, If you keep creating stories that reinforce this negative stereotype, then that's going to keep making people, unfortunately, sometimes fall into those quote unquote stereotypes, because that's all that seems to be the only way that society, or at least American society, accepts them in. It's the only role that American, or excuse me, let me say the realty. It's the only place, it's the only area that white society will accept you in. And so if you're going to be Black, you need to be good at a sport. If you're going to be Asian, you be good at this. If you're going to be a Native American, you have to be good at this. And I think that, like you said, it's just about that understanding that in life, when we do, it's like you said, it's lazy. It's lazy in general, and it's a part of a bigger problem.